Everyone, I want to welcome you to Profitable Pursuits. I am extra excited for this interview because we speak the same language. I want to welcome Brian to the show. Thank you for being here. And
Thanks for having me.
let's just jump into it. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your firm, what you do? Give us the lowdown.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Basinger. I started out, like a lot of us, working a W-2 job and started my firm on the side, and eventually was able to switch over and do it full time. I ended up growing that firm and sold it about a year and a half ago, and now I am kind of trying to remake that firm in a new model. And ultimately, we help entrepreneurs change their perspective on tax from historical and just being compliant to looking ahead and trying to get strategic so they can lower taxes and then use what's in the tax code to actually help build their wealth more effectively.
I could just geek out. I love that. I love it's using something that we all have to comply with, but to your benefit, right?
Yeah.
We don't have to
Yeah.
pay taxes, but how can we benefit from the tax code? Because there's so many opportunities. Super cool.
I think it's really similar to what you do in that we all have to do our books, but are we actually taking that information and using it to look ahead and get information that can help us make better decisions for what's coming, or is it just about what already happened?
Right. So often, as I'm sure you've experienced in the accounting, tax, finance world, people just want to tell you what you did in the past, which is great, but you have to use that information to move forward.
Yep. 100%.
Cool. For sure. The biggest thing that we can all relate to as business owners is that we have to attract, obtain, whatever verbiage you want to use, clients. That's just the reality of it. We don't have business if we don't have clients, whether it's brick and mortar or a service base like you have. What is your best tips, tricks to attract clients and to get your name out there?
What I have found has worked best for me is to, as much as I don't enjoy it. I'm a pretty private person, but I have to make a conscious effort to put my thoughts and ideas out there. And so a big part of what I spend my time on is thinking about the problems that my clients might be facing, which oftentimes are the same problems that I'm facing, and trying to come up with novel ideas or concepts around that. And they're not all totally original, and then putting it out there in whatever format. And so, we use a lot of different formats. Probably the one that we get the most traction on is Instagram and Facebook, and we're playing around with YouTube. But ultimately, that all has to funnel somewhere. And then we direct people to a couple of different areas. I've been running a live webinar every week for the last 6 months, and that's been an interesting experience. But even from there, we funnel people to one-on-one calls because our business is so personal, and ultimately we've found that that's where everything really has to end up. So we know that for us, that's probably not the case for every business owner out there, but for us, that's where it all has to point to. And so everything we have points to that. And then I just get on the phone, and honestly, it's not really, I don't look at it from a salesy perspective. It's just a conversation, and we're talking about what they need and what we offer. And if it makes sense to work together, it usually works out. And if not, then that's totally okay too.
Cool. I love that. It's a very similar model, just sharing perspectives. And what I liked what you said in the beginning was so often people forget we're humans too behind it. We have businesses that have to comply with tax. We have to use the numbers from our accounting data to drive decisions just like every other business owner. And we're no different or no better, right? We have the same challenges.
Right. Yeah, it's so funny to say that because I hear that all the time that well, you're a CPA, so all this stuff, must just come naturally for you. And no, it doesn't. I have to figure out my taxes and figure out my finances, same as everyone else does.
Absolutely. And to give yourself space to do that, right? Sometimes you just have to pause and do the strategy. You just gotta sit and think. And absolutely. Cool.
And probably we all, I suppose, run into the same issues of time constraints, where it's I need to I have this whole list of things to do. What's going to fall to the bottom? And I find in my own life, the same as many entrepreneurs, that the financial stuff a lot of times ends up at the bottom of the list and keeps getting punted and punted and punted. So like, yeah, that's a struggle that
I
we
think
all
we all
probably
have,
have in common.
for sure. I love how you humanize it. So many people see it separate, and most business owners, entrepreneurs, regardless of if your service, product, we're all doing the same thing. We're all talking about what we need to do. We should probably talk about it a little bit more in whatever medium that is, to your point, and just get out there, right, and share our opinions.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. What as you sold your business, what was your biggest like learning or takeaway from selling a business?
Ooh, that's a question I haven't got before. That's really good. The biggest learning, it's funny, big part of the reason why I decided to sell it was because I had so many clients that have gone through similar, the similar stage and process where they're looking to sell. And I thought I will 100% learn something from this, regardless of whether it turns out to be a good choice or a bad choice, down the road. So I learned a couple of things. The first one is how important the relationships are to my business and to myself, and that it really was difficult to untangle those two things from each other. That the business I was selling was one of relationships, and to just like sell those in a transactional way was not nearly as clean as I expected it to be. And the second thing, which is related, was that I would have put a lot more time and effort into vetting the buyer next time. I mean, if and when I make that decision again, I will be much, much more picky about who I allow to entertain the idea of buying a business. Whereas before, I thought of it more like a house, where it's like, I don't really care who buys it. They're going to buy it, and it's their asset to deal with. But because of those relationships, it, I think, is actually really critical to make sure that you have a buyer that you're on the same page with, and that you guys have a good plan for transitioning and making sure that these relationships that are important, they're people, that they stay happy throughout the process.
For sure. I was on a call with a client this morning. We help a lot of people buy businesses, and like, what should we evaluate the thought? What should we offer? And even looking at their side going in, they know like you have to be so careful and you're teeter-tottering a line because someone else has built all these relationships and you're buying relationships.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it's easy to overlook, though. You look at profit and loss statements and cash flow statements, and it could be really easy to just think of this thing as like an impersonal asset and forget about the human beings that really comprise that asset.
Yeah, I like that. Let's just jump into it. Do you have like your favorite tax tip or strategy that, while it may not apply to everybody, could apply, like maybe a fun one you like to share? I don't get to ask everyone that question.
It's funny. I think so. We have like a little framework that we use to do tax strategy, and it starts out with situational awareness. So you have to understand, forgetting any strategies, just if you don't do anything, what's your next year going to look like? What will your tax return look like? What other things do you have going on? Are you buying a house? Are you buying a business? Are you selling a business? Just what does the landscape look like? You have to start there. Then you can get into the strategies with that situational awareness. You can say, well, I don't like this and I don't like that. That seem to be, I'm on that path if I don't make any changes. Then you can look at the strategies, and those really come down to looking at entity structures to make sure that income is flowing in the most effective way for taxes, looking at deductions, and then looking at wealth strategies and saying, we have a little bit of extra money. How do we invest that in a way that gets us tax benefits? So we're investing pre-tax instead of after tax. But the biggest kind of overarching thing across that whole framework is the idea that we should be thinking about taxes and asking, how can we do this thing that we want to do? Not just, can I do it? Like, can I deduct this thing? No, that's the wrong question. We want to ask, how can I deduct it? The answer may be, when we get down to it, that, you know, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And there's almost always a way to deduct it, but maybe it's too much work, too much hassle, and it's not worth the financial, you know, benefit of taking that deduction or shifting that entity structure, or doing whatever it may be. But there's always a way. And so the question should always be not, can I deduct my car, but how can I make it so that my car is a legitimate deduction? Not, can I deduct my second home, but how do I make it so that that's a legitimate deduction? And going through that process and asking how, instead of just.
It's a mindset shift.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's not one that, I mean, we've had the opportunity to talk with tons of tax people and we collaborate with a bunch, but that's not what many people say. But that mind shift could save you thousands. Right.
Yeah.
Asking how instead of can I, like, what needs to happen? So, right, how do I do this? And it also potentially, as you said, it's just not worth it, but let's evaluate whether it's worth being able to do or not.
That's absolutely right. You know, back to that situational awareness, like, you know, we may come up with a baseline scenario where we say, look, if we don't do anything, this is what your tax return is going to look like. And then maybe there are 5 different things that we could do to lower taxes. And maybe 2 or 3 of those don't make sense at the end of the day. It's like, well, maybe there is some risk involved and the person is really risk averse, or maybe it's just a lot of hassle, or sometimes there are like other fees, attorney fees or things like that you have to deal with. And the combination of all those might mean that you decide not to go one direction. But usually, well, first off, you should have those options in front of you so you can make a choice, right? And then second, usually if you can see that stuff coming far enough in advance, then you can say, okay, how do I plan for that? How do I, you know, maneuver so that this isn't as much of an inconvenience? And that's all just so much easier to do. Let's say, like, literally right now for this tax year, instead of waiting till the year's done, getting to that point where we're getting ready to file the return and then wondering, oh, you know, how can I lower this? And then the only thing that's left at that point is like, well, just stuff more money into a retirement account. You're not going to see it for a couple decades, but.
Yeah, I love that idea of a mindset shift. How instead of, so good. Let's talk about, I normally like to ask people, if you had to build your firm up again, or your business or whatever it is, in half the amount of time, how would you do it? But like, you're in that situation, right? So you just sold a rather successful business and now we're building again. So how are you going to do it quicker? Like,
it's funny because it's been about 1.5 years since I sold it, and we're probably about half as big as we were when I sold it. So what took 5 years has kind of happened almost unintentionally in 1.5 years. So it's just so much easier once you get your feet under you. But with that said, I probably wouldn't, if I were going to do it again, I probably wouldn't have sold. I probably would have taken that and built on it and made changes and done things differently. But in terms of just doing it faster, we keep coming back to mindset, but really it is so critical. I think so often we get in our own way, where we get stuck in these mental loops. And because we're maybe not sure what to do, we don't do anything and we just kind of walk in circles, or go find a distraction and go do that. And just knowing what to do, it's an unfair advantage. It's not really a great answer to your question, maybe, but I think if I were going to start even like another business in an unrelated field, the biggest thing that I would try and do, applying that lesson across, you know, an industry, is just take action. Like, don't let yourself think about how am I going to do this perfectly. Just take one step, take another step. If you need to go back and fix something, you always go back and fix it. But consistent steps forward is the way to make progress. And I think too often the fear of not being perfect keeps us from taking those steps.
I was just analyzing, like, when we see businesses, we work with a lot of businesses from startup to multi millions at this point. And I was evaluating like what businesses make it, because we're in that era, in my opinion, where a lot of businesses are starting to, I don't want to say die off, but close their doors, the COVID bust is over, versus the ones that are flourishing, growing. And I think one of the biggest differences is the action, or like, you know what to do, so just start doing, do more, talk less type thing.
Yeah, that's well said. Do more, talk less. I really like that.
So many people know what to do, or you may not know like the quote unquote perfect answer. There is no perfect answer. Just move.
Yep. Yeah.
Right.
That's right. And there, I mean, honestly, there's so much information out there that and I still make this mistake. I'm sure we all do, but there's so much information we can get stuck in this loop of like, oh, if I listen to this podcast, no offense to that, I have one too, but like, if I listen to this podcast, I'll find the answer there. It's like, you may find an answer, but that'll be a lot easier to implement if you're actually making progress. What's that analogy of like the rudder doesn't do anything unless the boat's moving? And I think applies to knowledge. Like if we're moving, then we can steer. If we're not moving, then, setting the perfect course and steering all the right ways doesn't actually do anything.
For the most part, like if we can just totally be real, at the end of the day, all these podcast hosts, gurus, whatever, like myself included, everyone's really saying the same thing. Like, and no discount to anybody. We're all really just saying the same thing, and it's whoever you resonate with that makes you take the action.
That's exactly right. Actually, that is like, that's a light bulb thing. It's in fact, as people who I mentioned earlier, like people who are producing content in some form or another to try and speak to an audience, there's nothing we're really going to say that someone couldn't go find online. The thing that really is going to affect how people see us and how we resonate with people is if we can convince those people to actually take action. That's huge what you just said. That was just an epiphany for me. Thanks.
Cool. I'm glad it worked out. That's what I got to remind myself. Some people are like, oh, it's all copyright. Well, it's all copyright. It's all just reiterating what someone else said. But whoever resonates, like, just do it. And that's okay. Just find who works for you. Alrighty. I am obsessed with the internet because it brings connections like this that you wouldn't normally have. And one of my favorite parts is one that you get to meet people that I wouldn't meet in my hometown here in South Carolina. Or you also get inspired to take different actions. So I like to end the segment with, what's like a big goal or something you're working on that you're like super excited about, if you don't mind sharing.
I am trying to create a little bit of a different model or add on a model, which I think is, having looked at your website, is something you're can probably relate to. But generally speaking, most entrepreneurs are underserved when it comes to their tax strategies, because there are two types of accountants. There's the type that's really, really expensive and gives really good strategy. And then there are the accountants that are, but most entrepreneurs can't afford that first type, right? And then there's the type that has lower prices, so they work with all the other entrepreneurs out there. And just by, not because they're bad people, not because they're trying to do anything wrong, but because of their business model, they're like in this middle ground of like, they're not cheap, but they're not expensive enough to only work with a few people. So they end up serving way too many people and having this watered down service. And that's what most entrepreneurs are used to when it comes to their accountants. And I have had so many conversations with entrepreneurs where they'll say, I'll talk with them a little bit about strategy. It's not going to be a fit because they're not going to be able to afford to actually work with us one-on-one. And I'll say, well, what do you recommend? Where do I go? And there aren't a lot of good options out there. So what I'm trying to create is something that will allow us to handle the strategy piece at a cost-effective way for like the mass amounts of new business owners that are just getting started. So they don't have to like go through and make all these mistakes and like pay tens of thousands of dollars sometimes in extra taxes to the IRS, and learn that way, that we can be proactive in getting some strategy and advice to them. And so that's what I'm trying to create and have made some steps towards, but there's still, a wide gap between where I'm at and where I want to go with that. So that's my big goal.
Such a needed, and I didn't know that was your goal before we got on this call, but it is such a needed field. I could talk for hours, just about the experience that growing entrepreneurs who are growing and scaling business deserve when it comes to tax strategy, also like broken down in like a way that they understand. And the number of entrepreneurs who come to us and like, someone won't pick up the phone, they won't return my email. And while we try to beat that stigma when it comes to your accounting, your fractional CFO and bookkeeping, I appreciate to hear it on the tax side, because it's really a partnership, that whole financial picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And and it's a bit of a challenge, right? To say, well, like what I described is not because people are unwilling or like don't want to help. It's one of those things where it's like, you can get 2 of the 3 good, fast, or cheap. And just one of those market forces where I think it's difficult. People want to go to one accountant and have that person be their person. It's like, this person's going to take care of all my money stuff. And then I don't have to think about it anymore. And that's fine if you're willing to pay a lot of money to that person. But how do we create something that lets people still offload some of, not bear the entire burden themselves, but do it at a price point where it's not, it's not prohibitive. So it is a challenge, but it's a fun one.
Brian, where can people follow you, learn more about your services? Where can they continue the conversation with you?
Yeah, 2 places. First, Instagram is where we're generally most active. So that's just Brian Basinger _CPA. And then our website, contigoadvisors.com, is the other place. And on the website, we'll have, announcements for whatever live. We always have some live event coming up. So usually weekly, I'll do a live Q&A. Those are free. You can join it and generally talk about some kind of tax topic, and then do an open forum. So if you have a question and you're waiting 2-3 weeks to hear back from your CPA and just want like a second opinion, feel free to jump on any of those free calls, and we will,
we'll link it all below so it's easy to access, but make sure you go follow. It's not every day where you find a tax strategist who's willing to and has the time and makes the time, because no one really has the time to serve clients and serve, I like to call them friends on the internet rather than followers. But cool.
I like that.
I appreciate this conversation, and thanks for hanging out with me today.
Thanks, Cheryl.